Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
He was also ordained a Roman Catholic priest in 1965, so he's very well suited to talk about science and religion. It's something that's come up several times already, obliquely, so it's really good to have a whole talk on these aspects of how Lemaître linked his science and religion and how he interacted with the Pope, which we've heard already today actually had quite a profound influence on the way the Vatican viewed science and religion. But we look forward to hearing more about it from you. If you're ready with the tape, good.
A few little remarks at the beginning. I don't pretend by this title that Lemaître represents all of science. He was an eminent scientist of his time, which is very clear from everything that's been said already and everything we know. Nor do I pretend that the Catholic Church, of which I am a priest and Lemaître was a priest, represents all of religion. However, I think this period of history just preceding Lemaître and following his period and then following upon Lemaître up until the current day, with respect to those periods, with respect to Lemaître's interaction with the Catholic Church, are, if not completely representative of the interaction of science and religion, I think they're very helpful for us to understand the modern day interactions of science and religion, which of course are not the same in all countries, but nonetheless there is, I think, a character to them that is revealed by what I want to say. This is a very different kind of talk, frankly, than the ones you've heard, and it may make it more easy for you to take a nap, so don't hesitate. I would call this kind of episodic history. Okay. It's a history of a certain period and selecting certain episodes. I'm neither a historian of anything, certainly not of science or of religion. Nonetheless, I think my facts are correct through this period. Okay. But history is boring if you don't add some interpretation to the facts. So I will do that, and I will invite you very much to discuss my interpretations, argue with my interpretations or such. I really would. I don't say that just to be kind or courteous. I really would like your interactions to my interpretations. I'm going to show no picture of Lemaître. And while I hunted for a picture of God, I have no picture of God. I have no pictures. I have an outline of my talk that will help you to focus upon what I'm saying. This talk, obviously, because it is history, is footnoted quite a bit. Okay? And anyone who would like to bore themselves with going through this and looking up the footnotes, I'm most happy to give you a copy of this paper. I have it electronically, so just give me a request by email or so, and I'd be very happy to give it to you. Because the footnotes are, of course, important to the authenticity of the facts that I report. In order to appreciate the contribution of Georges Lemaître made to the relationship between science and religion, to my mind it is necessary to understand how the Catholic Church, of which he was a priest, passed in the course of 3 centuries from a position of conflict to one of compatible openness and dialogue. In doing this, I hope to show that the natural sciences have played a significant role in helping to establish the kind of dialogue which is absolutely necessary for the enrichment of the multifaceted aspects of human culture. I will speak of the following 4 periods of history: the rise of modern atheism in the 17th and 18th centuries, anti-clericalism in Europe, and especially in Italy in the 19th century, the awakening within the Catholic Church to modern science in the first 6 decades of the 20th century, and finally, the Catholic Church's view today following upon Lemaître. In his detailed study of the origins of modern atheism, Michael Buckley concludes that it was paradoxically precisely the attempt in the 17th and 18th centuries to establish a rational basis for religious belief through arguments derived from philosophy and the natural sciences that led to the corruption of religious belief. Religion yielded to the temptation to root its own existence in the rational certitudes characteristic of the natural sciences. According to Buckley, such philosophers as Leonard Lessius and Martin Mersenne decided that the existence of God must be so well established from philosophical arguments that evidence derived from religious experience itself became secondary or even forgotten. This rationalistic tendency found its apex in the establishment and the enlistment of the new sciences characterized by figures such as Isaac Newton and René Descartes to provide the foundations for religious belief. Although the Galileo case, as it is called, is thought to provide the classical example of the confrontation between science and religion, actually, a little aside, in the trial of 1633, science was not at the table. Galileo was never given the opportunity to talk out his science. It is really, however, in the misappropriation of modern science by such as Isaac Newton to mistakenly establish the foundations for religious belief that we find the roots of a much more deep-seated confrontation. From these roots, in fact, sprang the divorce between science and religion in the form of modern atheism. Thus, science served to corrupt religious belief. The certainties born of the scientific method gave birth to the desire for like certainties as a foundation for religious belief. That desire was radically misplaced and led to a lengthy period of misunderstanding between religion and science. I now turn to, yes, that's an outline. I now turn to a discussion of anti-clericalism. As to the second movement in the dissonant symphony between religious belief and science initiated by the rationalism of the 17th and 18th centuries, we turn now to 19th century anti-clericalism. Some episodes which reveal aspects of this anti-clericalism and its influence on the development of the relationship between science and religion are described by Sabino Maffeo in his History of the Vatican Observatory on the occasion of its 100th anniversary. In fact, the founding of the observatory by Pope Leo XIII in 1891 is set very clearly in that climate of anti-clericalism. And one of the principal motives that Leo XIII cites for the foundation of the observatory is to combat such anti-clericalism. His words show very clearly the prevailing mistrust of many scientists for the church. And I quote, so that, this is back a few centuries now, so that they might display their disdain and hatred for the mystical spouse of Christ, who is the true light, those born of darkness are accustomed to calumniate her to unlearned people, and they call her the friend of obscurantism, one who nurtures ignorance, an enemy of science and progress. I debated much with myself whether to do this, but you can see that kind of strong language in an anti-clerical setting. If you don't mind, I'd like to quote from the Independent of London of yesterday. And you know to which this refers. even to take it now, when he was only just stepped down as president, I think is terrible. It's adding yet more validity to an organization pushing the wrong sort of agenda. The Templeton Foundation is only interested in spreading religion and trying to make Christianity more acceptable. It gets a little more interesting. Atheistic freethinkers consider science is primarily about the reliable determination of truth. For this, evidence is essential, and the conflict between truth, in parenthesis, science, and congenital wishful thinking, in parenthesis, religion, is an ethical one and irreconcilable. So that kind of language, strong language of Leo XIII is not dialogue, but it's just language. Leo then terminates this motu proprio, in which he established the observatory by stating, in taking up this work, we have become involved not only in helping to promote a very noble science, which more than any other human discipline raises the spirit of mortals to the contemplation of heavenly events, but we have in the first place put before ourselves the plan that everyone might see that the church and its pastors are not opposed to true and solid science, whether human or divine, but that they embrace it, encourage it, and promote it with the fullest possible dedication. That is what I kind of characterize in my fidelity to the Catholic Church as a rather triumphalistic kind of way of putting things, but probably necessary in that climate of anti-clericalism that I just tried to establish. Now, to sum that up, although the historical circumstances did not provide a very healthy climate for dialogue between science and religion, the founding of the Vatican Observatory, even encouched in these triumphalistic terms, proved to be a quite positive contribution to the dialogue, as many of you know, both at the time of its foundation and in its subsequent 100 years history. Now I'd like to turn to the next period, and this involves Lemaître, sorry. The church is awakening to science in the beginning of the 20th century, and this brings in the role of George Lemaître in a bit more detail than the papers thus far have addressed it. For purposes of this paper and for the sake of brevity, when I speak of the awakening of the church to science during the first 6 decades of the 20th century, I am really speaking of the personage of Pius XII. He was a man of rich culture, and even in his youth he had become acquainted with astronomy through his association with Giuseppe Lais, an Oratorian priest, who was an astronomer at the Vatican Observatory, and the one most responsible for the completion of the International Sky Mapping Program at the Vatican Observatory. The Pope had an excellent college-level knowledge of astronomy, and he frequently discussed astronomical research with Daniel O'Connell, the then director of the Vatican Observatory. Pius XII's discourses on astronomical and cosmological themes are summarized in a book by P.J. McLaughlin, and I footnote that. However, the Pope was not immune from the rationalistic tendency which I spoke about before, and his understanding of the then most recent scientific discussions concerning the origins of the universe led him to a somewhat concordant approach to seeing in these scientific results a rational support for the scriptural and derived doctrinal interpretation of creation. This tendency was first revealed in an address he gave, Un'Orda, delivered to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in 1951. In this address, he attempted to examine the scientific results from which arguments for the existence of God the Creator might proceed. Even at that time, the papal discourse created a great deal of negative comments. But this was only the beginning of what was to be a very difficult period. It was only, in fact, through the most delicate but firm intervention of Georges Lemaître and Daniel O'Connell that the Pope was dissuaded from following a course which would surely have ended in troubling times for the relationship between the Church and science. The specific problem arose from the tendency of the Pope to identify the beginning state of the Big Bang cosmologies of that time, known principally to the Pope from Lemaître's book, The Primeval Atom. He attempted to identify this with God's act of creation. He had stated, for instance, contemporary science, with one sweep back across the centuries, has succeeded in bearing witness to the august instant of primordial light, fiat lux, when along with matter there burst forth from nothing a sea of light and radiation. Thus, with that concreteness which is characteristic of physical proofs, modern science has confirmed the contingency of the universe and also the well-founded deduction to the epoch when the world came forth from the hands of the Creator. And that is quoting the Pope. Lemaître, needless to say, had considerable difficulty with this view of the Pope. Although he was a respected cosmologist, he was also a Catholic priest, and since solid scientific evidence for his theory was lacking at the time, he was subject to the accusation that his theory was really born of a spirit of concordism with the religious concept of creation. Lemaître insisted, as we have already heard, that the primeval atom and the Big Bang hypotheses should be judged solely as physical theories, and that theological considerations should be kept completely separate. These contrasting views reached a climax when the time came for the preparation of an address which the Pope was to give to the 8th General Assembly of the International Astronomical Union, to be held in Rome in 1952. On his way to a scientific congress in Cape Town, South Africa, Lemaître stopped in Rome to consult with Daniel O'Connell, the director of the observatory, and with the Cardinal Secretary of State of the Vatican concerning this address which was being prepared by the Pope. The mission was apparently a success, since in his discourse, delivered on September 7, 1952, although the Pope cited many specific instances of progress made in the astrophysical sciences during the last half-century, he made no specific reference to scientific results from cosmology or the Big Bang. Never again did Pius XII attribute any philosophical, metaphysical, or religious implications to the theory of the Big Bang. What I'd like to do is summarize what I've said and then try and establish that there is a heritage to this episodic event of Lemaître and the Pope. I think we have inherited from that within the Catholic tradition, for sure, a certain attitude towards the dialogue. To summarize, from what has been said of the three selected historical periods, I believe we can conclude the following. First, as an inheritance from the origins of modern atheism in the 17th and 18th centuries, there has been within the Church a tendency to associate scientific research with atheism. Up until the 1970s, for instance, all of the organization of formal dialogue between the Catholic Church and the world of cultures, and especially science, was handled by the Vatican Secretariat for Non-Believers. Currently, it's called the Pontifical Council for Dialogue with Non-Believers. Most recently, this dialogue has been organized by the Pontifical Council for Culture, founded in 1982. So in a formal way, there's been kind of an institutional move of the church from seeing science, we deal with scientists in a council that deals with atheism, to we deal with the scientific culture in a council that deals with culture. Secondly, a type of siege mentality in response to the currents of anti-clericalism characterize the thinking of the church. Thirdly, when enlightened to the magnificent progress in scientific research in the first 6 decades of the 20th century, the Church and the Pope, in the person of Pius XII, wished too hastily to appropriate the results of science to its own ends. Recently, there has been a view from Rome, to call it that contrasts, in my mind, in a significant way with each of these previous historical periods. Since the intervention of Lemaître, which I have just described, set the stage for these future developments on the part of the papacy, I would like to briefly discuss these most recent developments as I think it can be called in some sense an inheritance of Lemaître. Although there have been many others, the principal source for deriving the most recent review from Rome concerning the relationship of science and faith is to be found in the message of John Paul II, written on the occasion of the tercentennial of Newton's Principia Mathematica, and published as an introduction to the proceedings of the meeting sponsored by the Vatican Observatory to commemorate that same tercentennial. The newness in what John Paul II has said about the relationship consists in his having taken a very positive position, completely different than the previous positions I had described. I would like now to briefly analyze that message in light of what I've just claimed. John Paul clearly states that science cannot be used in a simplistic way as a rational basis for religious belief. He says, for instance, Christianity possesses the source of its justification within itself and does not expect science to contribute its primary apologetic. Science must bear witness to its own worth, while each can and should support the other as distinct dimensions of a common human culture. Neither ought to assume that it forms a necessary premise for the other. The unprecedented opportunity we have today is for a common interactive relationship in which each discipline retains its integrity and yet is radically open to the discoveries and insights of the other. He furthermore states, and I quote, "Science develops when its concepts and conclusions are integrated into the broader human culture and its concerns for ultimate meaning and value. Scientists can come to appreciate for themselves that those discoveries cannot be a substitute for the knowledge of the truly ultimate. Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw one another into a wider world, a world in which each can flourish." From these quotations, I think one can conclude that nothing could be further from the attitude of Leo XIII at the founding of the observatory, born of the anti-clericalism of that time, than the following words of John Paul. "By encouraging openness between the church and the scientific communities, we are not envisioning a disciplinary unity between theology and science, like that which exists within a given scientific field or within theology proper. As dialogue and common searching continue, there will be a growth towards mutual understanding and a gradual uncovering of common concerns, which will provide the basis for further research and discussion. I would judge finally that the newest element in the new view from Rome is the expressed uncertainty as to where the dialogue between science and faith will lead. Whereas the awakening of the Church to modern science during the papacy of Pius XII resulted in a too facile appropriation of scientific results to bolster religious beliefs, Pope John Paul II expresses the extreme caution of the Church in defining its partnership in the dialogue. He says, exactly what form that dialogue will take must be left to the future. I consider this to be the newest and most important posture that the modern Church has taken in its approach to science. It is radically new and in complete contrast with previous history. It is diametrically opposed to accusations of atheism, to a posture of antagonism. It is awakened but expectant. I would like to end by addressing a question which John Paul II himself raises. Can science, he asked, also benefit from this interchange? To my mind, it takes a degree of courage for a pope to ask that question and a degree of openness to try and answer it. I do not believe that it has a very clear answer. In fact, it is very difficult to see what benefits to science as such, that is, as a specific way of knowing, might be. In the papal message, it is intimated that the dialogue will help scientists to express the scientific discoveries cannot be a substitute for the knowledge of the truly ultimate. In what way, however, do scientific discoveries participate, together with philosophy and theology, in the quest for the ultimate? This is to my mind, a serious and open question. Obviously, this so-called new view from Rome does not have all the answers, but it is an invitation to a common quest, a quest which owes a great deal to the spirits of Georges Lemaître. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any comments or questions? Let's start from that.
Yes, George. To what extent do you think that the Pope's embrace of Big Bang cosmology and his address to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences was the result of kind of counter-reaction to his paper, to his encyclical Humani Generis, which many people thought was an attack on science, a criticism of evolutionary theory and the like, and that what the Pope is doing, perhaps ultimately in a sense misguided, but what the Pope is doing is saying, oh no, look how positive I am with respect to science. So do you think that that part of the historical context, namely that the address to the Pontifical Academy comes a few years after the encyclical Humani Generis?
Bill, I think it would be a big stretch to connect the two. I really do. I think they're totally independent.
But both about science and both about religious belief?
Now, I'd have to think about it a bit more, but I don't find it very, certainly Humani Generis was for its time, okay, we have to judge all of these in the historical period, was kind of a very restrictive view of, well, we didn't know as much about evolution at the time, but I'm not excusing the Pope. I think it was a very, very cautious, restricted view of scientific evolution.
Just one fact, do we know who helped the Pope write the speech for the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, or do we know that he did it alone? Because often we know who authors are of papal documents, papal encyclicals. Do we know that with respect to this speech that he gave to the Pontifical Academy?
If anyone knows the origins of the papal speech, they're not speaking. And my estimation is that in many cases, not even God knows. Now, if you get into the sort of the origins of papal messages,
I think so. Stop that.
In your last section, I had a very strong feeling which you were saying that Pope John Paul II signed up to Stephen Jay Gould's separate magisteria.
thank you. I was hoping so.
I would instinctively say that was a substantial retrograde step. I've argued for a long time with people against the concept of separate magisteria. To me, science is a magnificent, expanded subset of the sum totality of human intellectual and spiritual experience. That's not to detract from science at all, but it's completely enveloped by faith. I'm surprised. Did I get it correctly from you that the Pope did say, in a sense, acknowledge a separate magisterium?
I'm not sure that I would go that far with those words, because they're words of Stephen Jay Gould, and has his sort of whole program to say those. On the other hand, I think it's clear that the Pope, if I re-quote him here, is saying that we should respect the total independence of these different areas, of human culture. But since they're both enriching areas of human culture, they should dialogue. But first of all, I don't think the Pope would use the word magisterium of religious faith. Something's been running through my buzz head here through the morning, and that is, I'll say it and then you can challenge it. Religious faith is not primarily a source of knowledge, of explanation. So it doesn't challenge science or even support science from the point of view of rational process leading to knowledge.
Yes.
It does that, but it's a secondary moment in religious faith.
Religious faith permeates every aspect of human act, ought, in my view, to permeate every aspect of human culture.
Well,
Not be
it's
separate.
totally excluded by many scientists, let's face it.
That's their problem.
Yeah, it's their faith.
Yes.
I mean, the exclusion of religious faith is itself a faith. The
Yeah.
atheism required. There is no proof for atheism, to my mind, unless someone can offer it to me.
Well,
There's no more proof than I can offer you
a
a
faith
proof.
position as much as theism. Yeah, which is what you say.
Yeah.
Atheism is
Which
a faith
is not
position,
very
and
much.
theism is a faith position.
Okay, yeah, but neither is very much as far as religious faith goes.
Yeah.
George, you say that the question of the possible forms that the dialogue of science and faith will take is open. May you suggest some idea on that? That is from your personal point of view. How you would envisage possible future steps about this issue? From a strategic and operative point of view.
It's very difficult because it
It's
varies.
very different.
Yeah, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and, improve it. But it varies so much in different cultures.
I mean in the kind of context, how it is according to your personal experience, because you are the one that who has a really big experience on that. What do you suggest as possible forms that this dialogue would take in a Catholic context? Even in a Roman context, if you like.
Well, I mean, it is clear, I think it's very clear, I don't think I'm being, a real wise man or anything saying that first of all, what do you mean by Catholic Church? But I'll say what I mean by it. That the Catholic Church has to be better informed on the science, and especially now in the biological sciences, in evolution, in genetics, has to be better informed. And so what I mean by the church are the Vatican offices, in this case, that have responsibilities in these areas. Pontifical Academy of Sciences has many very, very good scientists in their group, but that the Pontifical Academy of Sciences be allowed to exert more of an influence upon many of the other offices in the church, frankly. And I'm not, well, I am inclined by that it is a bit strangled, but I think that has to be loosened up.
Thank you.
That is primarily what has to be done. As a scientist within the Catholic Church, I think the Catholic Church is not well enough informed into science.
Do you think that it would be important a statement of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences pointing out the relevance of science for the Church?
Yes.
This would be good, no?
Yeah, that would be good. Obviously, that would be good.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, dear.
Just a comment about this two non-intersecting magisteria. I think that the offices of Rome, ecclesiastical offices of Rome, are strongly influenced by what happens in the field of theology in the world, in the Catholic universities, in the scholar world of many different things happen in the first half of the 20th century. You should not forget that this period was dominated by the positivistic philosophy. And one of the main dogmas, so to speak, of the positivistic philosophy was that everything which goes outside the empirical control is not only false, it is simply meaningless. And this was strongly against any religious belief. And Christian thinkers felt endangered by that, and they elaborated a certain strategy to answer that. And the key figure in this elaboration was a French philosopher, Maritain, and he coined the idea that we should accept the neo-positivistic Vienna circle philosophy as far as it is concerned with the philosophy of science, of its methodology of science, because it is correct. But we should reject the claim that everything which goes beyond the empirical control is meaningless. It is beyond limits of science, but not beyond limits of rationality. And so he accepted Maritain, the whole methodology of philosophy and science elaborated in the New Ages by St. Thomas and others. So we agree with neo-positivistic philosophy that science is limited to what is empirical, but the other philosophy of methodology is requested for theology. And the doctrine, and this was called in the Catholic Church the doctrine of two non-intersecting planes, the plane of philosophy and theology and the plane of science. And this was elaborated by Maritain. And this is accepted and repeated many times even now. And Lemaître was also exposed to that doctrine in Louvain. It was about the same time in which Lemaître was, Maritain was elaborating this idea. So this is still alive, this two non-intersecting planes. Yeah, and you should take into account that almost all people involved in the administration of Vatican asked the students of Catholic universities, especially Roman universities, and they are full of that God. And this doctrine is still with us. And today, I think, especially the studies of history of science, it shows us that even if these two planes are not intersecting, but they are immersed in a larger dimensional space, or culture which makes them somehow interact. And this is the main problem. In which the net and present times are involved.
Planes are sort of magisterial.
No, I would, I accept what Michael says. I mean, it brings to my mind that, just a very, very obvious, simple statement that human culture is vast. Literature, sculpture, the arts, music, philosophy, religious belief, theology. The most exquisite, richest person is one who you can't handle all of those, but why shut off, blind yourself to any one of those? I mean, why isolate the planes of science and theology, philosophy, when there's so many other parts of human culture that don't defeat one another. They don't. They interact. They interact in each one of us.
Now, it seems Michael's plea is to read into history where they were at the time.
Oh yeah. No,
because
you're doing
and maybe where people still are in many ways.
Yeah.
I think we'll do this in the right order.
Yeah.
The independence of the scientific approach and the religious approach, which was there in John Paul II's statement, that would probably be traceable back to a statement which I think is Gaudium et Spes from the Second Vatican Council, which talks about the autonomy of each subject area, which is an independence of methodology. So surely what the Church is asserting these days is that there are different methodologies. Science works in its own way, theology works in its own way, but that independence of methodology doesn't necessarily mean the subject matter is independent. So both science and the Catholic Church's position may have something to say about the origin of the universe or about the origin of human life. So there's a potential for conflict because the magisterium may overlap if it's only the methodologies which are independent.
I would extend that discussion only that the methodologies within philosophy and theology are many, and the methodologies within the sciences. I assume there's a commonality, but among the sciences, there are certainly different methodologies. Theologians have different methodologies.
I certainly agree with that. Dennis and I have long debates about biological sciences and physical sciences. They do come at things from different angles. I agree. I think, Brian, did you have a comment again, John?
I think John's comment is probably relevant first.
Okay.
Just apropos of what you just said, well, you didn't bring it up in your discussion, although I think it's one of the most fascinating things that Popper wrote was his letter to the Vatican astronomer, in which he said something, basically said that the Church faces a greater challenge now than it has since the 12th century when Thomas grappled with Aristotle in terms of science. And it seems to me that perhaps the challenge is greater in the biological sciences now rather than the physical sciences. And it's interesting that it doesn't seem to be in, I mean, I can think of, like Lemaître, of course, was a great mathematician and astrophysicist. But since, the death of Desjardins, I really can't think of anyone as prominent in the Church who was like a biologist. Of course, he was a biologist, he was a paleontologist, but who was grappling with the issues raised by human origins, anthropology, of course, now in genomics and genetics, all of which are kind of raising questions about what this means for
Well, you did ask for us to debate.
If you go to something that maybe doesn't directly report to the debater, but it does relate to something. I was just at a workshop with Stephen Hawking in Texas, and 5 days ago he gave a talk at Texas A&M University, and he made a statement that I thought was probably greatly misrepresenting something, and I wanted to ask you if you could help set the record straight. He was referring to the time when Hawking was at the Vatican Observatory at a meeting where he published the first publication of the idea of the no boundary wave function, which is in the book you edited.
Yes.
I have that back at home, but I must admit I don't carry it with me everywhere, so I couldn't check what's in the book. But so in this popular talk, that Hawking said, general relativity cannot predict how the universe begins, but only how it will evolve. Pope John Paul, this would be at this meeting, Pope John Paul said that we shouldn't inquire into the beginning, for that was the work of God. I was glad he didn't know I had a theory for the beginning. I did not want to face the Inquisition. And then he shows up a picture with him behind bars. So I was just curious if you remember, or whether it's in the book, what the Pope actually said, because I suspect Hawking was misrepresenting it.
So that, I'm sorry to be this abrupt about it, but that's Hawking at one of his best moments, and he's wrong. He's wrong in reporting. And,
Right.
you know, if you had the book, I could show it.
It is in the book. It's an all look at it.
Yeah, if you read the Pope's discourse,
Right.
and then read the way Hawking interprets it, Hawking is absolutely wrong. The Pope had said nothing about, you know, scientists should not be investigating. He had no negative view of scientific investigation at any time. From the beginning, if there was one, up until the end, if there is one. There was no limitation by the Pope. In fact, it was just the opposite. It was an encouragement, you know, to go ever deeper into the origins of the universe, however. That's come up time and time again. Hawking is absolutely misrepresenting the Pope, and the documentation shows that.
Yeah.
Did you have a very short comment?
I have discussed several times with John Paul II the problem of cosmology. He was interested about the Big Bang and things like that. And I must say he was very well informed about the nature of the initial singularity, Big Bang, and whether it is against creation or for creation. He knew everything very well. But I can understand Hawking, because what he writes is very in the style of John Paul. He could just, he could be joking about that. With his characteristic smile, he would say, oh well, don't touch this, but it was like a joke, if it was true. But I am sure that what Hawking writes does not represent those views.
Well, he also had misquoted Augustine, because the only thing he quoted from Augustine was that, you know, what happened before the world began? Well, maybe God was preparing hell for those who ask such questions. You know, whereas if you really read Augustine said we must not answer as the wag who says God was preparing hell for people that, you know, Augustine goes on to say it's a serious question and demands a serious answer.
And in his later works, Hawking already quotes Augustine in the correct way.
Okay, yeah, this was a
Oh, so we may put the record straight. Yes.
You said earlier that the church needs to get better informed of the sciences, and so I'm wondering what you might suggest that they do with that information.
Well, one thing, you know, these are very specific questions that I think seminary training, for instance, should incorporate more of the sciences. And there are others here who could say something to that, either in favor or against what I'm saying. But typically, seminary education, certainly in the United States, is very, and even, I'm sorry to pat myself on the back, but even Jesuit seminaries, when I was coming through, I had no college education. I've never had a college education.
Oh, but you got 9 PhDs.
They're all pieces of paper. But seriously, that will be a start. That's seminary education, so that when these people grow up,
Well, yeah,
and I say people, male and female.
Yeah. But, I mean, that's good for its own sake. I mean, did you have a particular idea in mind of what the church ought to do with this sort of information, as far as how it looks at doctrine that is related to creation and so forth, or in its ministry, and how what it says about these things? I mean, how is this information to be used by the church? If they need this information and they don't have it, and they go and they get the information, how are you suggesting it be used or interpreted?
Depends on the specific issues. So certainly any dogmatical issue that they want to address, that they hear out the best science. They hear it out so that they have the basis upon which to make good decisions. And once said in Pontifical Academies, why do we so often make decisions, moral and doctrinal, on poor science when the good science is available? And you're going to have a good or better decision based on the good science. But frankly, many times they don't. So I'll give you a specific example, okay? A very high church disciple of John of Pope Ratzinger, at that time, Father Ratzinger, etc. Cardinal Archbishop of Vienna publishes an article in the New York Times op-ed page in which he says that neo-Darwinian evolution is a pure random process and is not compatible with Catholic teaching. Well, he's obviously twice wrong. On the scientific issue, he's wrong because it is not a pure random process. And on the theological or church teaching issue, it's perfectly compatible with church teaching.
So, yeah, so.
And then you sort of get an answer back, well, why did this become a public issue? I felt like saying, Your Eminence, what do you think the New York Times op-ed page is? A high school yearbook or something? I mean, I'm sorry to be somewhat critical, but I'm trying to be critical and move it forward. Okay.
Should we take one last question?
Yeah, well, whenever I hear about science and religion, I always feel there's an asymmetry because science doesn't have one institution, and religion, well, in your case, it has one institution because you didn't talk about religion, you talked about the church, and within the church you didn't talk, for instance, about science in the Jesuit schools in the 17th century, but the Vatican in the 19th and 20th century. But I was wondering, so 50 years ago, 52 years ago, there was a famous C.P. Snow's Two Cultures, right, in which the great divide is between the humanities and the sciences. And at the time, he says, okay, people in the humanities should stop looking down upon the sciences because we humanists or literary people or people with the languages, they despise science as something that's kind of second-rate knowledge. With that interaction, I would like your opinion on to what extent the problems or the challenges that you are talking about between the Catholic Church and science is not just one example more of these two cultures divide. And to what extent, from an institutional point of view, is any different to, for instance, the problems between science and science policy makers in the state, in the government, and so on?
Okay, that's a multifaceted question. I'll take the easiest part first, and the last statement you made. It's equally true that policymakers, I think they do better, but just as the church must listen to science, policymakers and governments should listen carefully to the best of science. Of course, the best of science sometimes is not very decisive with respect to policymaking. I mean, climate change is a perfect example where you don't have a well enough established, in my mind, scientific input to policy. But to get back to your question, or at least the climate of your question, I mean, it's certainly true that science is universal. Right? Michael, you tell the story when you wrote a book that had to be reviewed under communism, and you said that physics is the same, like the law of gravity is the same in London, Paris, Nigeria, Washington, and Berlin.
Almost good.
And it came back the same in London, Rome, New York, and East Berlin.
Even in other galaxies, but the same.
So, more seriously, there's no doubt about it that the diversity of religious belief, religious groups, etc., is immense. And how science deals with, there is no way in which science can deal in a common way with all religious groups. I mean, just in the United States, you know, from a fundamentalist, literalist view of scripture, you know, to the Catholic Anglican tradition, which differ, you know, among themselves, etc. That is a problem, by the way. That's a serious sociological problem. The religious belief comes in many different forms.
Thank you. We'll just make one comment about climate change. That actually the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is probably the most coherent set of scientists from all the different nations of the world coming together and agreeing on one issue that has ever been done on any issue. So actually, that one example of set up by governments, by scientists, I think is a case where people coming from different places, different cultures, different religions, and different presuppositions have actually come together completely with one message. Now, whether governments implement that is another
No, I was not aware that there was even that common.
the IPCC
Is it so common that it doesn't say anything?
No, it says, I mean, the agreement it has is remarkable. I think Brian, Pete would agree with this, that it's an incredibly powerful grouping. And all the main academic institutions of science and all information seem to agree with that.